The rain hammered against the windshield of the Mercedes E-Class with a violence that matched the storm tearing through Evangeline Colton's chest. October in Portland had always been unforgiving, but tonight the weather felt personal, as if the sky itself had decided to weigh in on how thoroughly her life had collapsed. She sat behind the wheel in the Motel 6 parking lot, engine off, heat fading, watching condensation bloom across the glass like frost claiming territory. In the back seat, buried under a mountain of blankets and pillows that had once decorated a penthouse in the Pearl District, her daughter Bryn slept with the stillness of a child who had learned not to ask questions anymore. The 6-year-old clutched a threadbare doll named Magnolia, its porcelain face chipped from 8 months of living out of cardboard boxes and grocery bags. The back seat had become their bedroom, the trunk their closet, the dashboard their kitchen table. This was home now. This was what remained after everything else had been stripped away. Evangeline's phone vibrated against her thigh, the screen illuminating her face in harsh blue light. She didn't want to answer. She knew what was coming. But ignoring Marcus Henderson had never worked before, and it wouldn't work tonight. She pressed the green icon, her hand trembling so badly the phone nearly slipped. Marcus Henderson's voice cut through the line with the warmth of a scalpel, no greeting, no preamble, just the cold efficiency of a man who billed $400 an hour to destroy people's lives. Ms. Colton, Judge Morrison issued her preliminary ruling this afternoon at 4:30. I'm calling as a courtesy, though I'm not required to. You have exactly 72 hours from this moment to demonstrate to the court that you possess a fixed residential address, not a motel, not a vehicle, not a shelter, and a stable family structure suitable for raising a minor child. Failure to meet this standard will result in temporary custody transferring to Mr. Preston Colton pending the final hearing. The clock started at 4:30, Ms. Colton. That gives you until Monday at 4:30. 72 hours. No house, no family structure, no daughter. I trust I've been clear. The line went dead before she could respond. Evangeline pulled the phone away from her ear and stared at the black screen, watching her reflection stare back. The woman looking at her was a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt. Hair that had once been styled by professionals now hung in unwashed tangles around a face that had aged a decade in 8 months. The navy Tahari suit she wore, wrinkled and stained along the hem, had cost $850 2 years ago, when Bright Path Learning was still a company, when she was still a CEO, when her life still made sense. She set the phone down on the passenger seat and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, feeling the cold leather against her skin. The pain in her chest was so physical, so present, that for a moment she wondered if this was what a heart attack felt like. Not the dramatic clutching and gasping of television, but this quiet suffocation, this slow crushing of everything that mattered. 72 hours. 3 days to conjure a home out of nothing. 3 days to manufacture a family from thin air. 3 days to convince a judge that she wasn't what she knew herself to be. Broken, homeless, desperate, and utterly alone. The thought that followed was so dark, so heavy, that it took her breath away. What if they were right? What if Bryn would be better off in Preston's mansion in Laurelhurst, with the private tutors and the heated swimming pool and the stability that only old money could provide? What if the most loving thing a mother could do was admit defeat? She lifted her head and looked in the rearview mirror at her daughter. Bryn had kicked off one of the blankets in her sleep, revealing the pink unicorn pajamas that were 2 sizes too small now, the ankles riding up to mid-calf. The child's face was peaceful in a way that broke Evangeline's heart. Bryn had stopped asking when they would have a real home. She had stopped asking why Daddy didn't want to see her anymore. She had stopped asking why Mommy cried in the bathroom at McDonald's. She had just stopped asking. That silence was worse than any tantrum, any tears, any rage. It was the silence of a child learning that hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. Evangeline turned the key in the ignition, feeling the engine sputter to life. The gas gauge hovered just above empty. She had $17 in her checking account. The credit cards were maxed out or canceled. The thought of facing another night in this parking lot, of watching Bryn wake up to the same four metal walls, of brushing her teeth with bottled water in a gas station bathroom, made something inside her crack wide open. She pulled out of the parking lot without a destination, driving through rain-slicked streets that blurred into rivers of red taillights. The windshield wipers beat a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. 72 hours, 72 hours, 72 hours. When she saw the neon sign for Riverside Diner glowing through the downpour, she pulled into the lot on instinct. The 24-hour diner had become her office over the past few months, the only place with free Wi-Fi and bathrooms that didn't require a purchase. She needed to send emails to legal aid organizations. She needed to search for emergency housing. She needed to do something, anything that felt like fighting back. The diner was nearly empty at 11:45 on a Thursday night. A trucker sat at the counter nursing coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. An elderly couple shared pie in a corner booth, their silence comfortable in the way that only comes from decades together. And in booth 7, near the window, a man sat with a young girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Evangeline carried Bryn inside, the child stirring but not waking as they moved from the cold rain into the warm, fluorescent embrace of the diner. She slid into booth 3, settling Bryn on the vinyl bench beside her, and pulled her laptop from her bag. The MacBook Air was 3 years old, the screen cracked along one corner from the day the FBI had raided the office, and she'd dropped it on the marble lobby floor, but it still worked. It still connected her to the ghost of her former life. She ordered coffee and a bowl of oatmeal for Bryn, the cheapest items on the menu, and opened her email. 47 unread messages, most of them automated rejections from the legal aid requests she'd sent out over the past week. She was about to click on the first one when Bryn stirred beside her, those blue-green eyes blinking open with the confused vulnerability of a child waking in an unfamiliar place. "Mama, where are we?" Evangeline brushed hair back from her daughter's face, forcing a smile that felt like it might shatter her jaw. "We're getting dinner, sweetheart. Are you hungry?" Bryn nodded, sitting up and looking around the diner with the wariness of someone who had learned that new places often meant new disappointments. She clutched Magnolia tighter, the doll's porcelain head leaving an imprint on the child's cheek. The waitress brought the oatmeal, and Bryn ate slowly, mechanically, while Evangeline pretended to work on her laptop. But her eyes kept drifting to her phone, to the black screen that held the countdown she couldn't escape. She needed to call someone. She needed help. But everyone she had once known, the investors, the board members, the network of professional connections she'd spent a decade building, had vanished the moment the scandal broke. Everyone except Sloane. Her sister answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Ava, what's wrong? It's almost midnight." Evangeline opened her mouth to speak and found her throat closing. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't force words past the knot of panic and grief lodged behind her sternum. When she finally managed to speak, her voice came out as a whisper. "Sloane, I need help. I need—" Marcus called. The judge ruled. "I have 72 hours to prove I have a home and a stable family, or Preston gets temporary custody. I don't have 72 hours. I don't have anything. I'm living in my car with Bryn and I can't do this anymore. I can't lose her. She's all I have left and I'm going to lose her because I can't even provide a roof over her head." Sloane's silence on the other end of the line was worse than any platitude she could have offered. Evangeline could hear her sister breathing, could picture her sitting up in bed in her Boston brownstone, one hand on her pregnant belly, weighing the impossible mathematics of 3 children under 5 and a sister who needed rescuing. "Ava, you know I would if I could. But with the new baby coming and Thomas's hours at the hospital and the kids, we barely have room to breathe here. I can send you some money. Maybe 500? Would that help? $500. Enough for another week of motels and fast food. Not enough for first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. Not enough for stability. Not enough to convince a judge that she could provide the kind of home a child deserved. Thank you. I know you would if you could. I don't know what to do. I'm out of options. She heard Sloane exhale, heard the rustle of sheets as her sister shifted position. What about reaching out to some of your old colleagues, someone from Bright Path before everything happened? Evangeline closed her eyes against the sting of tears. They won't even return my emails. I'm toxic, Sloane. No one wants to be associated with the CEO whose CFO embezzled $2.3 million. It doesn't matter that I was cleared. It doesn't matter that I didn't know what Trevor Walsh was doing. All they see is the scandal and the FBI raid and the company that went bankrupt while I was supposedly in charge. I'm unhireable. I'm untouchable. And Preston made sure everyone knows it. Sloane's voice softened into something that sounded like pity, and Evangeline hated that sound more than she hated anything else in her life right now. I'm so sorry, honey. I wish I could fix this, but you're going to find a way. You always do. You're the strongest person I know. They said goodbye, and Evangeline set the phone down on the table next to her untouched coffee. Strong. Everyone always said she was strong, as if strength alone could manifest a home out of desperation, as if willpower could rewrite the past 8 months into something that didn't end with her daughter being taken away by a man who had promised forever and then walked away the moment her success became scandal. She looked across the diner and realized that Bryn had fallen asleep again, her head pillowed on folded arms, the oatmeal half-eaten in front of her. The child looked so small, so fragile, so utterly dependent on a mother who couldn't even provide the most basic security. Something broke inside Evangeline then. Not the clean break of a bone snapping, but the slow crumbling of a foundation that had been eroding for months. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against the cool Formica tabletop, and she let herself break. The sobs that came were silent, convulsive, the kind that shook her shoulders and stole her breath. She didn't wipe away the tears that ran down her face and pooled on the table. She just let them fall. The words that came out were so quiet she wasn't sure if she'd spoken them aloud or only thought them. A prayer hurled into the void by someone who had stopped believing in answers. God, I need a miracle. I need a home, and I need someone who won't walk away when things get hard. I need 72 hours to not become the mother who lost her child. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching, didn't hear the man who had been sitting in booth 7 stand up and walk across the diner, didn't know she was no longer alone until a $20 bill appeared on the table next to her hand, and a voice like gravel and smoke said words that would change everything. Save those tears. No mother should have to cry like that. Evangeline lifted her head so fast the room spun. Through the blur of tears, she saw a man standing beside her booth, and her first instinct was to be embarrassed, then defensive, then angry at this stranger who thought he had the right to intrude on her private devastation. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of men who worked with their hands. Mid to late 30s, with brown hair that needed cutting and a beard that was more functional than fashionable. He wore a navy flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with scars and calluses. His jeans were spattered with dried concrete, his work boots caked with mud. Everything about him said blue collar, practical, solid. His eyes were what stopped her from telling him to leave. They were dark brown, almost black in the diner's harsh lighting, and they held something she hadn't seen in a long time. Not pity, not judgment, just a kind of exhausted compassion. as if he understood exactly what it felt like to be drowning. Evangeline wiped her face with the back of her hand, trying to pull herself together, trying to remember what dignity felt like. "I'm sorry. I'm leaving. I didn't mean to bother anyone." "You're not bothering anyone. I couldn't help but overhear your call. You said you need a house and a family to show a judge tomorrow, or you lose your daughter. Is that right?" The question was so direct, so stripped of pretense, that Evangeline found herself answering before she could think better of it. 72 hours. Not tomorrow, but yes. That's what I said, and it's none of your business. I don't know who you are, but I don't need charity from strangers. Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "It's not charity. I have a house, 3 bedrooms, fenced yard, everything a family court judge likes to see in a home study report. I live there with my daughter and we have plenty of room. You need an address and a family structure. Consider it done." Evangeline stared at him, certain she had misheard, certain this was some kind of cruel joke or hallucination brought on by exhaustion and despair. This didn't happen in real life. Strangers didn't walk up to desperate women in diners and offer to solve their problems. Men didn't volunteer to upend their lives for someone they'd never met. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me. Nobody does anything for anyone for free these days. What's the catch? What do you want?" The man looked back at booth 7, where the little girl sat coloring on a paper menu with crayons the waitress had brought. The child had dark blonde hair pulled into a lopsided ponytail and wore a purple dress that had clearly been through multiple wash cycles. She was focused on her drawing with the intense concentration of a child who had learned to entertain herself. As Evangeline watched, the girl reached for the ketchup bottle to use as a weight to hold down the paper, and knocked it over instead. The bottle hit the table and exploded, sending ketchup spraying across the table, the bench, and the child's dress in a spectacular arc of red. The little girl froze, her eyes going wide with an expression that said she'd made this kind of mistake before and knew what came next. The man, Evangeline still didn't know his name, let out a short laugh that held more exhaustion than humor. He turned back to her, and his expression shifted into something between resignation and conspiracy. "Look, I'd do it anyway because no child deserves to be away from their mother. But since we're making deals here, if you could give me a hand with that," he gestured toward the ketchup disaster, "I'd appreciate it. I'm great at framing walls and pouring concrete, but I'm completely useless at getting ketchup stains out of dresses. Let's call it a fair trade. I give you the house and the family structure. You help me not lose my mind trying to be a single father who doesn't know the first thing about raising a little girl." Evangeline looked at the mess in booth 7, then at this strange man who was offering her salvation wrapped in self-deprecation, then at her own daughter sleeping peacefully beside her. Every instinct screamed that this was insane, that she should thank him politely and walk away, that accepting help from a stranger was dangerous and desperate and exactly the kind of decision that proved Preston right about her judgment. But she had 72 hours. She had $17. She had a 6-year-old daughter who deserved better than the backseat of a Mercedes. And she had nothing left to lose. "Seriously? You're being serious right now? Because I can't play games with my daughter's life. If this is some kind of joke, I'd rather keep sleeping in my car." The man reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He extracted his driver's license and held it out to her, his expression patient. "Callan Reed, 38 years old. Address is 847 Elmwood Drive in Beaverton. Take a picture if you want. Send it to someone. Do whatever you need to do to feel safe. But I've never been more serious about anything in my life." Evangeline took the license with shaking hands and photographed it with her phone. The picture showed the same man standing in front of her, maybe a few years younger, his expression carefully neutral in that way everyone looked in DMV photos. The name matched. The address looked real. She photographed his license plate number through the window, a blue Ford F-250 parked 3 spaces down, and texted everything to Sloane with a message that felt both paranoid and necessary. If I disappear, Callan Reed, 38, Reed & Sons Construction, 847 Elmwood Drive, Beaverton, OR. Call police immediately. Sloane's response came back within 30 seconds, 3 question marks and a string of worried emojis. Evangeline looked up at Callan Reed, this stranger who was offering her a lifeline for reasons she couldn't begin to understand, and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. All right, I'll help with the dress, but as for going to your house, I'm driving my own car and following you. And before we take one step out of this diner, you're standing still while I take your picture and send it to my sister with your location. If you're some kind of predator, the police will know exactly where to look for you. Callan didn't look offended. If anything, he looked relieved, as if her caution somehow validated the entire insane proposal. Fair enough. You're a good mother, Evangeline. Smart and careful. Take whatever photos you need. Let's do this the right way. He knew her name. She hadn't told him her name. For a moment, panic flared, but then she realized he'd overheard her call with Sloane, heard her sister use her nickname. It wasn't sinister. It was just what happened when you had a breakdown in a public place. She followed him to booth 7, Bryn still sleeping in booth 3, and assessed the damage. The ketchup had indeed gone everywhere, coating the table, the bench, and creating an impressive bloom across the front of the girl's purple dress. The child looked up at her with those wide, scared eyes, and Evangeline felt something in her chest tighten with recognition. This was what children looked like when they'd learned that mistakes had consequences they couldn't control. She grabbed napkins from the dispenser and wet them at the water station, then added a splash of club soda from the bar. She worked quickly and efficiently, the muscle memory of 100 spilled drinks and food disasters from Bryn's early years taking over. Salt to absorb the liquid, club soda to dilute the stain, gentle dabbing rather than rubbing to lift the color without setting it deeper into the fabric. Within 10 minutes, the dress was damp but clean, the red stain reduced to a faint pink shadow that would disappear completely in the wash. The little girl stared at her with an expression close to awe. "You're like magic. How did you do that?" Evangeline felt herself smile for the first time in what might have been weeks. "Not magic, sweetheart. Just practice. I have a daughter about your age, and she's spilled more things than I can count." She looked up and found Callan watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not gratitude exactly, something deeper. As if he'd just witnessed proof of something he'd hoped was true, but hadn't been sure of. Behind them, Bryn had woken up and wandered over, clutching Magnolia and looking at the scene with shy curiosity. The two girls noticed each other at the same moment, and something shifted in the air. Callan's daughter held up her doll, a bedraggled fairy princess with tangled blonde hair and a torn dress. "I have a doll too. Her name is Princess Sparkle. What's yours?" Bryn hugged Magnolia tighter but answered in a whisper. "Magnolia. She's a Southern belle." "That's pretty. Do you want to see the picture I'm drawing?" Bryn looked up at Evangeline with a question in her eyes, and Evangeline nodded. Within moments, the two girls were sitting side by side on the bench, heads together over the crayon drawing, and Evangeline felt tears threatening again for an entirely different reason. When was the last time Bryn had played with another child? When was the last time her daughter had looked that relaxed, that normal, that much like the carefree 6-year-old she should have been? Callan's voice was quiet when he spoke, meant only for her. "My wife Sarah died 2 years ago. Breast cancer, stage 4. I've been trying to hold it together for Hadley. That's my daughter. But I'm failing more than I'm succeeding. going through the motions, keeping the lights on, making sure she eats something other than pizza. But when I heard you on the phone, when I heard you say you might lose your daughter, I remembered what it felt like to watch Sarah slip away and know I couldn't stop it. This time I can stop something. This time I can keep a family together, so I'm going to. The honesty in his voice, the raw grief beneath the practical words, hit Evangeline harder than any argument he could have made. This wasn't about charity or pity. This was about a man trying to find meaning in his own loss by preventing someone else's. She found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone, not even Sloane. About Trevor Walsh, her CFO, who had been embezzling from BrightPath for 18 months before she discovered the discrepancies. About the FBI raid that had destroyed their office and her reputation in a single morning. About Preston filing for divorce 48 hours later with a statement to the press about protecting the Colton family name. About losing their house, her savings, her career, her entire identity in the space of 6 months. He said I was damaged goods, said being associated with me was bad for business, bad for the family legacy, bad for his future in Portland society. Now he wants Bryn because his grandfather threatened to cut him out of the trust if Preston doesn't prove he's a responsible family man. It's not about love. It's about a 90-year-old patriarch who thinks bloodlines and appearances matter more than anything else. And I can't fight it. I have no money, no home, no way to prove I can provide stability. Callan listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and pulled his truck keys from his pocket. Follow me home. Let's see what we can build in 72 hours. The drive from the diner to Elmwood Drive took 18 minutes through rain that showed no signs of stopping. Evangeline followed the taillights of Callan's truck through residential neighborhoods that got progressively nicer, the houses larger, the yards more manicured. By the time they pulled up to 847 Elmwood Drive, she was starting to wonder if this had been a mistake. The house was beautiful. A craftsman-style bungalow with a deep front porch, cedar shake siding, and a front yard enclosed by a white picket fence. Flower beds that needed weeding flanked the walkway. A porch swing hung from chains at one end of the porch. Everything about it screamed stability, permanence, the kind of home that family court judges loved. Callan parked in the driveway and walked back to her window. She rolled it down, and he leaned in, rain dripping from his hair. I know it looks nice from out here. Full disclosure, the inside is a disaster. I've been focused on keeping my business running and Hadley fed. Housekeeping fell by the wayside, so if you're expecting better homes and gardens, prepare to be disappointed. He wasn't exaggerating. When they stepped inside, Evangeline saw exactly what he meant. The house had good bones, beautiful hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, crown molding, but it was buried under the accumulated chaos of single parenting. A mountain of clean laundry sat unfolded on the sectional sofa. Toys created an obstacle course across the living room floor. Empty pizza boxes from at least 3 different deliveries sat on the kitchen counter. The sink was full of dishes, but it was warm. It was dry. It was a house, not the back seat of a car. Hadley immediately led Bryn upstairs to see her room, their voices drifting down as they chattered about dolls and favorite colors. Evangeline stood in the entryway, dripping rainwater onto the hardwood, and tried to process what was happening. Callan ran a hand through his wet hair, looking almost embarrassed. I know it's a mess. I'm good at building structures, terrible at maintaining them. Evangeline looked around and felt something shift inside her. Not horror at the chaos, but recognition. This was a problem she knew how to solve. This was a challenge that fit the skills she'd spent 10 years developing as a CEO: organization, systems, efficiency, execution under pressure. She turned to face him, and for the first time since Marcus Henderson's call, she felt something that might have been hope. This is perfect, Callan. We have 68 hours. Let's make this house look like the happiest, most stable family in Oregon." They worked through the night in a kind of desperate partnership that felt both strange and oddly natural. Callan took the kitchen, scrubbing dishes and wiping down counters with the methodical focus of someone doing penance. Evangeline tackled the living room, creating systems for toys and books, folding the mountain of laundry into neat stacks organized by person and type. At 3 in the morning, Callan made coffee so strong it was almost undrinkable, and they sat at the kitchen table making lists. Not just cleaning lists, but the story they would need to tell. The fabricated history of a couple who had been together for months, who had fallen in love slowly and carefully, who had decided to combine their families because it made sense for everyone involved. "How did we meet?" Callan leaned back in his chair, thinking. "The diner. 7 months ago. You came in late after a meeting. I was there with Hadley after work. Something about it felt right, so I gave you my number. First date? Coffee shop in the Pearl District. 2 weeks later, we talked about what it's like to rebuild after losing everything." They created details with the precision of architects drafting blueprints. His side of the bed, left, always left, because he wanted to be between the door and her. Her coffee order, oat milk latte because she couldn't process dairy. His one decent recipe, pot roast, his grandmother's method, the only thing he could cook that didn't come from a box. Her morning routine, checking email at 6 a.m., a habit from her CEO days that she couldn't break. They memorized Bryn's peanut allergy, the name of her favorite teacher, the specific shade of teal she insisted was different from regular blue. They memorized Hadley's fear of the dark, her doll Princess Sparkle's origin story, the way she wouldn't eat eggs unless the yolk was fully cooked. By 6 a.m., they had a story. By 7, they had staged the master bedroom, moving Evangeline's meager possessions into the walk-in closet beside Callan's clothes, placing her books on the nightstand, her toothbrush in the bathroom. They took a quick photo together at the breakfast table with both girls, printed it at the Walgreens that opened at 7, and framed it for the dresser. When the girls woke up and came downstairs, Evangeline was making pancakes from a mix she'd found in the pantry, and Callan was teaching Hadley how to set the table properly. It was a performance, a carefully constructed simulation of normalcy. But when they all sat down together and Hadley asked Bryn if she wanted to be sisters, and Bryn looked up at Evangeline with hope blazing in her eyes and whispered, "Yes," it stopped feeling like pretending. The courthouse on Monday morning was everything Evangeline had feared. Preston sat with Marcus Henderson and 2 associates, their presence radiating the kind of confidence that only unlimited legal resources could provide. Preston looked exactly as he always had, blonde hair perfectly styled, Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than Callan's truck, Patek Philippe watch catching the fluorescent lights. He had the kind of handsome that came from good genetics and better skin care, the assured posture of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. He didn't look at Evangeline when she walked in with Callan. He looked through her, as if she were already erased. Judge Catherine Morrison entered the courtroom with the brisk efficiency of someone who had heard every story and believed very few of them. She was in her late 50s, with steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that could probably cut through concrete. She banged her gavel once, and the room fell silent. "Custody of Bryn Colton. Mr. Henderson, you claim housing negligence. Present your evidence." Marcus Henderson stood with the smooth confidence of a man who had won before he'd even walked into the room. He placed a manila folder on the judge's bench and began pulling out photographs like a magician revealing cards. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. Ms. Colton has been homeless for 8 months. These photographs, taken over the past 2 weeks by a licensed private investigator, show Ms. Colton's vehicle packed with personal belongings and parked at various motels throughout the greater Portland area. Credit card statements confirm charges at Motel 6, Budget Inn, and multiple fast food establishments. The child has missed 7 days of school in the past month. My client, Mr. Preston Colton, offers a 7-bedroom estate in Laurelhurst, private tutoring, and the financial stability that comes from a family with multi-generational wealth. This is not a difficult decision, Your Honor. It's a matter of basic child welfare. He sat down with a look of satisfaction that made Evangeline's stomach turn. She felt Callan's hand close around hers under the table, his palm warm and solid and real. She hadn't asked him to do that. He just did it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Judge Morrison looked at the photographs with an expression that gave nothing away. Then she looked up at Evangeline. Ms. Colton, do you have representation? Evangeline stood on shaking legs. No, Your Honor. I've been unable to retain counsel. And what do you have to say about these allegations? Before Evangeline could answer, Callan stood. The scrape of his chair against the floor drew every eye in the courtroom. Your Honor, that information is outdated. Preston's sneer was audible. And who are you, her lawyer? Callan turned to look at Preston for the first time, and something in his expression made Evangeline's ex-husband stop smiling. No, I'm Callan Reed, and Evangeline doesn't live in a car anymore. She lives with me. The silence that followed was so complete that Evangeline could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Judge Morrison leaned forward, her interest finally engaged. Explain, Mr. Reed. Callan pulled a folder from his jacket pocket, and Evangeline realized he'd prepared for this, had thought ahead in ways she hadn't even considered. He laid out documents on the table with calm precision. 847 Elmwood Drive, Beaverton, Oregon. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, fenced yard. Bryn has her own room with a twin bed and full closet. She ate breakfast there this morning. Pancakes. She helped set the table. Marcus Henderson was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, this is clearly a last-minute arrangement designed to circumvent the court's... Judge Morrison held up one hand and Marcus fell silent. Mr. Henderson, let him finish. Callan laid out the evidence they'd assembled over 3 sleepless days. The updated driver's license showing Evangeline's new address, the utility bill with both their names, the school emergency contact form for Hadley Reed that listed Evangeline Colton as an authorized guardian and backup contact. We've been together 7 months, Your Honor. We met at Riverside Diner last March. We took it slow because we both have daughters who needed time to adjust. But when Evangeline's landlord evicted her 3 weeks ago, we decided to stop waiting. Our girls are already best friends. We're building a family. Not a perfect one, but a real one. He sat down, and Evangeline felt something in her chest crack open. He'd said it with such conviction, such quiet certainty, that for a moment, even she believed it. Preston stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled. This is fraud. They barely know each other. He's some random construction worker she found. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Mr. Colton, sit down, now. Preston sat, his face red with fury. The judge looked at the documents in front of her for what felt like an eternity. Then she looked at Callan, at Evangeline, and something in her expression shifted. Mr. Henderson, your client has deep pockets and an impressive estate. Ms. Colton has Mr. Reed and what appears to be a functional household. I will not award custody based solely on bank account balances. Here is my order. 90-day probationary period. Joint temporary custody. Bryn stays with Ms. Colton at the Elmwood address 4 days per week, with Mr. Colton 3 days per week. Child Protective Services will conduct 3 unannounced home visits. Final hearing on January 15th. If this home proves stable, custody remains with the mother. If there is any evidence of fraud, coercion, or instability, custody transfers to the father. Do we understand each other? Evangeline nodded, not trusting her voice. Yes, Your Honor. Preston and Marcus exchanged a look that promised this was far from over. Yes, Your Honor. The gavel came down again. Court dismissed. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Preston cornered Evangeline while Callan was talking to the clerk about paperwork. He moved into her personal space with the aggressive confidence of someone who had never been told no. 90 days, Evangeline. That's all you bought yourself. I have private investigators. I have resources you can't even imagine. When this house of cards falls apart, and it will fall apart, Bryn comes home to Colton Manor where she belongs. My grandfather doesn't care how much this costs. He cares about bloodlines and appearances. And you're an embarrassment to both. Callan appeared beside them before Evangeline could respond, and Preston took a step back. Up close, the difference between them was stark. Preston, polished and manicured and aristocratic. Callan, rough-edged and work-worn and immovable. Mr. Colton, you're in her personal space. Step back. Preston looked Callan up and down with obvious disdain. Enjoy playing house, Reed. I give it 3 weeks before you realize what you've gotten yourself into. She's broke, she's unemployable, and she comes with baggage that'll ruin whatever sad little life you've built. When you walk away, and you will, I'll be there to pick up the pieces and take my daughter home. He walked away before Callan could respond, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor with metronomic precision. Evangeline stood there shaking, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened crash over her. They'd won. She hadn't lost Bryn, but Preston was right about one thing. They had 90 days to make this work, and after that she'd be right back where she started. Only this time Callan would know exactly how broken she was. She felt his hand on her shoulder, solid and warm. We should go home. Get some sleep. Figure out what comes next. Home. He'd said it so easily, as if it were already true. As if the house on Elmwood Drive had become theirs in the space of 72 hours. They collected the girls from the courthouse child care center, where they'd been waiting with a social worker, and drove back to Beaverton in a convoy of 2 vehicles. When they pulled into the driveway, Hadley and Bryn tumbled out of Callan's truck, chattering about some game they'd invented, and Evangeline sat in her car for a moment longer, looking at the house with its deep porch and white fence. Somewhere between the terror and the desperation and the impossible deadline, she'd stopped thinking about this as a temporary solution. She'd started thinking about it as survival, as the only chance she had to keep her daughter. She got out of the car and walked up the porch steps where Callan was waiting with the front door open, and she understood what she'd agreed to. 90 days of pretending to be a family. 90 days of building something real enough to fool investigators and judges and her ex-husband's expensive lawyers. 90 days to not fail at the only thing that mattered anymore. She stepped through the doorway and heard Callan close the door behind them, shutting out the rain and the cold and the impossible pressure of everything that could still go wrong. For now, they were inside. For now, they were safe. For now, that would have to be enough. The first morning arrived too soon, and not soon enough. Evangeline woke to unfamiliar ceiling beams and the disorienting weight of safety, her body slow to recognize that she wasn't in the Mercedes, that Bryn wasn't wedged against her in the back seat, that the sound filtering through the walls was breakfast being made rather than the hum of highway traffic. She checked her phone. 5:30 a.m. 89 days left. Downstairs, Callan stood at the stove in flannel pajama pants and a faded navy t-shirt, assembling lunchboxes with the methodical precision of someone who had done this too many times alone. 2 thermoses of apple juice, 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, 2 Ziploc bags of baby carrots. He looked up when she entered, his hair sticking up on one side, exhaustion evident in the shadows under his eyes. Morning routine. Hadley's bus comes at 7:15. Bryn's at 7:30. Figured we should coordinate. The casual assumption of partnership in that statement, we should coordinate, felt both presumptuous and necessary. They were performing cohabitation for an audience that could appear at any moment, and every detail mattered. Evangeline moved to the counter where he'd laid out bread and peanut butter, then stopped herself. "Bryn's allergic to peanuts. Severely. I should have mentioned that yesterday." Callan set down the knife immediately, his expression shifting from tired to alert. "How severe?" "Anaphylaxis. She needs an EpiPen within minutes, or she could die." He pulled the peanut butter jar away from the workspace and washed his hands thoroughly, then grabbed a different jar from the back of the pantry. "Sunflower seed butter. Hadley likes both, so we can use this for everyone. Safer that way." The fact that he'd adjusted instantly, without making her feel like an inconvenience or a complication, did something strange to Evangeline's chest. Preston had always treated Bryn's allergy like a personal affront, an embarrassing weakness that required constant management and apology. They worked side by side assembling lunches, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same items. Each accidental contact felt loaded with the awareness that they were strangers performing intimacy, that every gesture was both genuine and calculated. When both girls appeared in the doorway at 6:45, Hadley in mismatched pajamas with her hair in yesterday's lopsided ponytail, Bryn in the unicorn set that was 2 sizes too small, Evangeline felt the performance shift into something more complex. This wasn't just about fooling investigators. This was about creating a morning routine that would make sense to children who needed structure more than they needed truth. Hadley climbed onto a kitchen stool and watched Evangeline with open curiosity. "Are you going to live here forever now?" The question hung in the air, too big and too simple. Callan looked at Evangeline across the counter, and in that moment they both understood that whatever they said next would become canon in the mythology they were building. Evangeline knelt down so she was eye level with Hadley. "I'm going to live here as long as your dad and I are together. Is that okay with you?" Hadley considered this with the seriousness of someone weighing cosmic implications. "Will you do my hair? Daddy doesn't know how to make it not hurt." Something in Evangeline's throat tightened. "I can do your hair. Would you like braids or a ponytail?" "Braids like Bryn's." Bryn looked down at her own hair, which Evangeline had hastily braided the night before, and smiled with something that looked like pride. By 7:15, both girls were fed, dressed, and waiting at the end of the driveway with matching backpacks. Evangeline had managed to tame Hadley's hair into 2 French braids that would actually last the day, and Hadley had hugged her with the fierce gratitude of a child who had been managing disappointments for too long. When the bus pulled away, Callan turned to Evangeline with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You didn't have to do all that. The braids, the lunch coordination. We could have kept things separate." "If we keep things separate, Angela Reeves will know the moment she walks through that door. We're supposed to be a couple who's been together 7 months. We need to act like people who've built routines together, who know each other's rhythms." Callan nodded slowly, something shifting in his face. "You're good at this, the planning, the systems. I can see why you were a CEO." The past tense in that sentence, "were a CEO," landed like a physical blow. Because she wasn't that person anymore. She was someone who lived in her car and accepted help from strangers and pretended to be part of a family that didn't exist. She went back inside without responding, and Callan didn't follow immediately. When he came in 10 minutes later, he was carrying a toolbox and a determined expression. "I need to fix the porch railing before the inspection. Wood's rotted through in 2 places. If Bryn leans on it, the whole thing could collapse." He disappeared outside, and Evangeline found herself alone in the house for the first time since they'd arrived. She walked through the rooms they'd cleaned in desperate haste, seeing details she'd missed in the chaos. Family photos on the mantel that were all of Callan and Hadley, and a woman who must have been Juliet. Beautiful and blonde and smiling with the confidence of someone who didn't know she had 2 years left. Books on the shelves about grief and single parenting and how to talk to children about death. A wedding photo on the hallway wall showing Callan 20 pounds lighter and infinitely younger, standing next to Juliet in a white dress on a beach somewhere warm. Evangeline stopped in front of that photo and studied the man in the picture. He looked happy in a way that was almost painful to witness. Whatever had happened in the years between that beach and this hallway had carved away everything soft and left only the essential structure. She heard the sound of hammering from the porch and felt something uncomfortable twist in her chest. Guilt, maybe. Or recognition. She was using this man's grief and loneliness to solve her own problems, and no amount of helping with laundry or braiding hair would make that transaction balanced. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Colton, this is Angela Reeves, CPS investigator assigned to your case. First home visit scheduled for this Friday, 6 p.m. Please ensure all household members are present and the residence is accessible for inspection. This visit may last 1 to 2 hours. Failure to comply will be noted in my report. Evangeline stared at the message, her pulse accelerating. Friday. 3 days away. 3 days to make sure every detail of their manufactured life was airtight. She found Callan on the porch, stripped down to a t-shirt despite the October chill, replacing boards with the focused intensity of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Sweat darkened his shirt between his shoulder blades, and his forearms flexed with each hammer strike. There was something almost meditative about the way he worked, as if the physical labor provided a kind of peace that thinking never could. Angela Reeves is coming Friday at 6. She says 1 to 2 hours. Callan drove a final nail flush with the board and looked up at her. That gives us 3 days to make sure we know each other's answers. CPS investigators don't just look at the house. They interview people separately. Ask questions only couples who actually live together would know. They spent that afternoon like graduate students cramming for an exam they couldn't afford to fail. Sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and notepads, they built a relationship from scratch with the precision of architects designing a structure that had to withstand hurricane-force scrutiny. Which side of the bed do you sleep on? Left. Always the left. I started doing that after Juliet got sick, because the bathroom was on the right and she needed to get up multiple times during the night. After she died, I couldn't break the habit. The specificity of that detail, the grief embedded in a sleeping position, made Evangeline's stomach twist. I sleep on the right. I'm a light sleeper, and I wake up if I hear anything unusual. It drove Preston crazy because he said I was too jumpy. Do I snore? Yes, but only when you sleep on your back. You have a deviated septum from a construction accident 5 years ago when a 2x4 fell and hit you in the face. It broke your nose in 3 places. Callan reached up and touched the slight crook in his nose, surprised. How did you know that? I didn't. But now I do, and so do you, and that's the kind of detail that makes people believe you've been intimate with someone. She was right. Over the next 2 hours, they constructed an intimacy from fragments of truth and necessary lies. She told him about her lactose intolerance, her obsession with checking email at 6 a.m., her inability to sleep if any lights were on. He told her about the pot roast that was the only recipe his grandmother had taught him before she died, about his tendency to talk in his sleep about lumber measurements and load-bearing calculations, about how he ran hot at night and she'd need to steal the blankets around 3 in the morning. They memorized the small catastrophes that became funny stories. The time he tried to cook a romantic dinner and set off the smoke alarm, the time she'd given a presentation with her shirt on inside out and hadn't noticed for 3 hours. They built a mythology of first kisses and fights and reconciliations, of quiet mornings and difficult conversations, and the slow decision to combine their lives. By the time they heard the school bus rumbling up the street at 3:30, they had a relationship that felt almost real on paper. Whether it would survive Angela Reeves's interrogation was another question entirely. That night, after the girls were in bed, Callan stood in the doorway of the master bedroom with an expression of uncomfortable resolve. We need to talk about sleeping arrangements. Evangeline looked up from the novel she'd been pretending to read. "I thought we agreed you'd take the couch." That was before I got an email from Preston's lawyer. They're filing a motion to depose both of us under oath, asking intimate questions about our living situation. They're going to try to prove we sleep separately, that this is a fraud. If Angela shows up at midnight, which she's allowed to do, and finds me on the couch, that's game over. The logic was airtight and terrifying. Evangeline looked at the king-sized bed that dominated the room, then at Callan standing in the doorway like he was waiting for permission to enter his own bedroom. So, we share the bed, with a pillow barrier down the middle. You stay on your side, I stay on mine. And if she asks specific questions about sleeping habits, then we tell her the truth we just made up. You snore when you're on your back. I steal blankets at 3 a.m. You sometimes put your cold feet on my legs and I complain about it. We build enough details that they can't poke holes. Callan nodded, but he didn't move from the doorway. Something in his posture suggested this conversation wasn't finished. I need you to understand something. I haven't shared a bed with anyone since Juliet died. The last person who slept next to me was dying of cancer and weighed 93 pounds and spent most nights crying because the pain meds weren't enough. I don't know if I can do this without... He stopped, his throat working like he was trying to swallow something sharp. Without what? Without having nightmares. Without waking up thinking she's still here and then remembering she's not. Without making this harder for you than it already is. Evangeline stood up and walked to where he stood, close enough to see the exhaustion written in every line of his face. We're both doing things we're not ready for. We're both pretending to be people we're not sure we can be. If you have nightmares, you have nightmares. If I have panic attacks about losing Bryn, I have panic attacks. We'll figure it out as we go. That night they lay on opposite sides of the bed with a wall of decorative pillows between them, like a demilitarized zone. Evangeline stared at the ceiling, hyper-aware of Callan's breathing 6 feet away, of the weight of another person in the bed after so many months of sleeping alone or cramped in the front seat of a car. She heard him shift positions, heard the rustle of sheets. Evangeline? Yes? Thank you. For doing this. For not making me feel like a charity case when you're the one who needed help. She turned her head to look at the pillow barrier, at the man she couldn't see but could hear breathing in the darkness. You're not a charity case. You're the first person in 2 years who's treated me like I'm something other than a cautionary tale. He didn't respond, but she heard him exhale like he'd been holding his breath. They fell asleep like that, 2 broken people separated by pillows and grief and the desperate hope that 90 days would be enough. The week that followed established a rhythm that felt both artificial and increasingly natural. Mornings were choreographed chaos, lunches, braids, backpacks, the synchronized dance of getting 2 children ready for school. Callan left for work sites at 7:30, returning at 6 covered in sawdust and concrete dust and the particular exhaustion that came from 10 hours of physical labor. Evangeline spent her days cleaning the house to obsessive standards, researching CPS protocols and sending out resumes to companies that would never call her back. She also spent hours watching YouTube videos on how to braid hair, how to get ketchup out of fabric, how to make children's lunches that weren't just sandwiches and carrot sticks. Small skills that Preston's housekeeper had always handled, that she'd never needed to perfect when they'd had money and staff and the luxury of outsourcing domestic labor. On Wednesday afternoon, while the girls were at school, Evangeline was folding laundry in the living room when she heard a car pull into the driveway. She looked out the window and felt her blood freeze. A black Chevy Tahoe with tinted windows. A man climbing out with a professional camera with a telephoto lens. She grabbed her phone and texted Callan. "Preston's investigator is here, taking pictures." His response came back immediately. "Don't engage. Act normal." Act. He's trying to catch you doing something suspicious. But what counted as suspicious? Being home alone during the day? Folding laundry? She forced herself to continue with the clothes, creating neat stacks on the coffee table, while the man outside circled the house like a predator evaluating weak points in a fence. He was there for 20 minutes, photographing the exterior, the vehicles, the yard. When he finally drove away, Evangeline collapsed onto the sofa and tried to calm her racing heart. That evening, after the girls were asleep, Callan's laptop dinged with an email notification. He opened it, read for 30 seconds, and then pushed the computer across the table to Evangeline. The email was from Marcus Henderson, and it included 12 high-resolution photographs. Callan leaving the house at 6 a.m., Evangeline alone in the living room at 11, Callan's truck pulling into the driveway at 6:40 p.m., Evangeline bringing in groceries by herself at 2 in the afternoon. The text below the photos was clinical and devastating. Photographic evidence suggests Mr. Reed and Ms. Colton maintain separate daily routines with minimal interaction. Subject Reed departs residence early morning, returns late evening. Subject Colton observed alone throughout day. No evidence of cohabitation beyond shared address. Will present this documentation in motion to depose both parties under oath regarding fraudulent representation to the court. Evangeline read it twice, feeling the walls close in. They're going to destroy us. They're going to put us on the stand and ask questions we can't answer, and then they're going to take Bryn and I'll never get her back. Callan closed the laptop and ran both hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration she was learning to recognize. Then we need to actually live like a couple, not just stage the appearance of one. That means coming home for lunch. That means you texting me during the day about normal things. That means anyone watching needs to see two people who are actually building a life together, not two strangers sharing an address. The next morning, Callan came home at noon with sandwiches from a deli near his work site. They ate together at the kitchen table while Evangeline told him about the freelance consulting inquiry she'd received from a startup in Seattle. The first legitimate interest in her skills in 8 months. He told her about the foundation issues they'd discovered on the West Lynn project, how the previous contractor had cut corners and now the whole structure needed reinforcement. It was the kind of mundane conversation that couples had every day, and it felt both ordinary and revolutionary. For 45 minutes, she wasn't the disgraced CEO living in her car. She was just a woman having lunch with a man who cared about whether her job search was going well. When he stood to leave, he hesitated. This thing on Friday with Angela Reeves, she's going to ask me if I love you. The statement hung between them, too big for the kitchen to contain. What are you going to say? I don't know. What do you want me to say? Evangeline thought about the question, about all the ways it could go wrong. Say it's complicated. Say we're figuring it out. Don't lie and say you're in love with me because she'll know. But don't say no either because then she'll think we're just roommates. Say something true that sounds like love is possible. Callan nodded slowly, processing this navigation of truth and performance. I can do that. Friday arrived with the weight of an execution date. Evangeline spent the day in a state of controlled panic, checking and rechecking every surface, every room, every detail that might reveal the fragile architecture of their arrangement. She'd printed new photos and arranged them on the mantel. Pictures of their first date at Stumptown Coffee that they'd staged that morning, shots of the four of them at Laurelhurst Park that they'd taken on Wednesday evening after Callan got home from work. At 5:45, both girls were home, fed, and playing quietly in Hadley's room. At 5:50, Callan pulled into the driveway still wearing his work clothes, sawdust in his hair, looking exactly like a man who'd just finished a 10-hour shift and come home to his family. At 6 p.m. exactly, Angela Reeves knocked on the door. She was shorter than Evangeline had expected, with dark skin and sharp eyes that took in everything while revealing nothing. She wore a charcoal pantsuit and carried a leather portfolio that probably contained their entire lives reduced to forms and checkboxes. Mr. Reed, Ms. Colton, thank you for accommodating this visit. May I come in? Callan stepped aside, and Angela entered with the assessing gaze of someone trained to spot discrepancies. She walked through the living room, noting the toys organized in baskets, the family photos, the lived-in quality that wasn't quite clutter. Her pen scratched across her notepad, recording observations that would determine Bryn's future. In the kitchen, she paused at the refrigerator, studying the gallery of children's artwork, the grocery list in Callan's blocky handwriting that included Bryn's cereal, Cheerios, and the bright yellow post-it note that read, "Peanut allergy, Bryn, EpiPen in cabinet," in all caps. "You're very organized about the allergy protocol." Evangeline felt Callan tense beside her. "We have to be. One mistake could kill her. I have EpiPens in 3 locations: kitchen cabinet, my truck, and Bryn's school backpack." Angela wrote this down, her expression neutral. The girl's bedroom inspection was brief. Angela photographed the twin beds, the shared closet space, the bookshelf divided equally between Hadley's picture books and Bryn's early readers. She asked Hadley if she liked having Bryn here, and Hadley answered with the enthusiastic sincerity of a 7-year-old who'd been lonely for 2 years. "She's my best friend. We play dolls, and she taught me how to braid Magnolia's hair, even though Magnolia's is really hard because it's all tangly." When Angela opened the master bedroom door, Evangeline felt her pulse spike. This was the test. This was where fraud became visible. But the room looked exactly like it should. The king bed unmade from that morning scramble to get the girls to school. Callan's work boots by the door. Evangeline's book on the right nightstand, his stack of construction blueprints on the left. The closet showing both their clothes, her business casual mixed with his flannel and denim. 2 toothbrushes in the bathroom holder. The framed photo of the 4 of them at dinner on the dresser. Angela picked up the frame and studied it. "When was this taken?" Callan answered before Evangeline could. 2 weeks ago. Tuesday night. I made pot roast." "What's the recipe?" He didn't hesitate. "My grandmother's. Sear the beef with thyme and rosemary, then slow cook for 4 hours with carrots, potatoes, and onions. Juliet, my late wife, used to say it was the only dish I didn't ruin. Evangeline says it's better than anything her ex-husband's chef ever made." The detail about Juliet, the easy inclusion of his dead wife in the narrative, gave the story a texture that scripted lies never had. Angela set the photo down and made another note. "Mr. Reed, I'd like to speak with you privately. Kitchen, please." They separated, and Evangeline waited in the living room with the girls, her heart hammering so hard she was certain Angela would hear it through the walls. She couldn't hear this conversation, just the low murmur of voices, the occasional pause that felt loaded with judgment. 15 minutes later, Angela emerged and gestured to Evangeline. "Miss Colton, your turn. Living room." They sat on opposite ends of the sofa, and Angela flipped to a new page in her portfolio. "How long have you known Mr. Reed?" 7 months. We met at Riverside Diner in March. Why did you decide to move in together now?" "My landlord evicted me 3 weeks ago when I couldn't make rent. Callan and I had been talking about combining households eventually, but the eviction accelerated the timeline. We decided it made sense for everyone. The girls were already close, and Bryn needed stability." "What side of the bed does Mr. Reed sleep on?" "Left. He started sleeping on that side when Juliet was sick because she needed access to the bathroom at night. After she died, he couldn't break the habit." Angela's pen paused, and Evangeline saw something flicker in her expression. Surprise, maybe, that she'd known such a specific detail. "What does he drink in the morning?" "Black coffee. He hates sugar. Says sweet things before noon make him nauseous." "Does he snore?" "Yes, but only when he sleeps on his back. He has a deviated septum from a construction accident 5 years ago. A 2x4 fell and broke his nose in 3 places." Angela leaned back slightly, reassessing. Those are very specific details for a relationship that's supposedly only 7 months old. When you're rebuilding your life with someone, you pay attention. Every detail matters because you're trying to build something stable from pieces that are all broken. For the first time, Angela's neutral expression cracked into something that might have been approval. She interviewed the girls together, asking gentle questions about their routines, their feelings about the new living arrangement, whether they felt safe and happy. Bryn answered with the careful politeness of a child who'd learned that adults decided things, but Hadley responded with unrehearsed enthusiasm. I love having Bryn here, and Miss Eva does my hair without hurting, and she makes really good pancakes, and she doesn't get mad when I spill things like Daddy does. Callan winced at that revelation, but Angela just wrote it down. At 7:45, after nearly 2 hours of inspection and interrogation, Angela stood at the door with her portfolio tucked under one arm. The home appears clean and appropriate for minor children. The girls demonstrate positive bonding. However, I'll note in my report that Ms. Colton still refers to you as Callan and Miss Eva, rather than using parental terms, which suggests some emotional distance. My next visit will be in 4 weeks, unannounced. You should expect it to happen at any time, day or night. CPS has authorization to conduct welfare checks without notice. She left, and the moment the door closed, Callan and Evangeline both exhaled like they'd been holding their breath for 2 hours. She noticed the names. That Bryn still calls you Chu Callan and me Miss Ava. Callan nodded, his jaw tight. We can't force it. If we push them to call us Mom and Dad, they'll resist, and it'll look even more fake. They'll do it when they're ready, if they ever are. That night, lying in bed with the pillow barrier between them, Evangeline stared at the ceiling and replayed the interview in her mind. They'd passed, barely, but Angela had seen the gaps, the places where their story frayed at the edges, where the performance showed its seams. Callan? Yeah? What did she ask you? In the kitchen? A long silence. Then his voice came through the darkness. She asked if I loved you. Evangeline's breath caught. What did you say? I said I care about you. That I care about Bryn. That I care about this family we're trying to build. And that if that's love, then maybe I'm falling into it and I don't know how to define it yet because I only know what losing love feels like, not what finding it again is supposed to be. She turned her head toward the pillow wall, wishing she could see his face. That was the right answer. Was it true? She thought about the question, about the way her pulse had jumped when he'd walked through the door at 5:50, still in his work clothes, showing up exactly when he said he would. About the way he'd learned to braid Hadley's hair by watching YouTube videos at 2 in the morning. About the way he'd memorized Bryn's allergy protocol like it was a matter of life and death, because it was. I think parts of it might be becoming true, which is either the best thing that could happen or the most dangerous. Neither of them spoke after that, but sometime around midnight, Evangeline woke to find the pillow wall had collapsed, and Callan's hand was inches from hers on the mattress between them, close enough to touch, but not touching. She left it there and went back to sleep. The days that followed developed a texture that felt less like performance and more like partnership. Callan started coming home for lunch twice a week. Evangeline started texting him photos of small household victories. Hadley's perfect French braids, Bryn's spelling test with a gold star, the pot roast she'd attempted using his grandmother's recipe that hadn't burned. He responded with photos from job sites, with questions about what to pick up from the grocery store, with updates on his day that felt less like checking boxes and more like actual communication. On a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks after Angela's first visit, Evangeline was in the living room working on a freelance proposal when she heard Callan's truck pull into the driveway earlier than expected. She looked out the window and saw him sitting behind the wheel, not getting out, his shoulders shaking in a way that made her stomach drop. She went outside in bare feet, the October cold biting through her thin cardigan, and knocked on the driver's window. He looked up, and she saw his face was wet with tears. It's Juliet's birthday. She would have been 38 today. And I forgot. I woke up this morning and went to work and didn't remember until I was driving home and saw the date on a permit, and I forgot my wife's birthday. Evangeline opened the door and climbed into the passenger seat, not touching him, just sitting there while he broke down in the way that men who'd learned to be strong rarely allowed themselves to do. You didn't forget her. You just forgot a date. Right? There's a difference. I'm replacing her. I'm letting someone else sleep in her bed and braid her daughter's hair, and I'm forgetting the most basic things about her, and it's only been 2 years. What kind of person does that? The kind who's still alive. The kind who has a daughter who needs a father, not a ghost. The kind who's doing what he has to do to survive. He turned to look at her, his face ravaged. Is that what we're doing? Just surviving? She didn't have an answer for that. Because somewhere in the last 2 weeks, survival had started feeling like something more complicated than just not dying. It had started feeling like building, like creating, like the terrifying possibility that they might be making something real from the architecture of desperation. I don't know, but we have 74 days left to figure it out. That night, Callan didn't come to bed. She found him in the garage at 3 in the morning, sitting on the concrete floor, surrounded by boxes of Juliet's things that he'd apparently never unpacked. Photo albums, clothes, a wedding dress still in its preservation bag. He was holding a framed picture of Juliet and Hadley at the hospital, Hadley newborn and pink and perfect. Juliet radiantly exhausted. Evangeline sat down beside him on the cold concrete. Tell me about her. And he did. For 2 hours he told stories about the woman he'd married on a beach in California, who'd worked as an elementary school teacher and sang off-key in the car and made him laugh even when they were broke and struggling, who'd fought cancer with the kind of courage that felt mythological, who'd held on for 2 extra months just to see Hadley's 5th birthday, who'd died on a Tuesday morning in October with her hand in his and their daughter at school so she wouldn't have to witness it. She made me promise I wouldn't turn into one of those widowers who builds a shrine and stops living. She said Hadley needed a father who could still find joy, not a memorial. But I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to be happy without feeling like I'm betraying her memory. Evangeline reached out and took the photo from his hands, studying Juliet's face. She looks like someone who would want you to braid your daughter's hair, even if someone else had to teach you how. Who would want you to help a stranger in a diner because it was the right thing to do. Who would understand that surviving doesn't mean forgetting. She set the photo back in the box and stood up, offering him her hand. Come to bed. You have work in 4 hours. He took her hand and let her pull him to his feet, and when they walked back into the house, something had shifted between them. Some boundary had been crossed or dissolved or simply acknowledged as more porous than either of them had wanted to admit. In bed that night, there was no pillow wall. They lay on their respective sides with empty space between them, but it wasn't empty. It was charged with the weight of everything they weren't saying, everything they were slowly becoming, despite their best efforts to remain strangers playing house. 3 days later, the world cracked open at 2:30 in the morning. Evangeline woke to Callan thrashing beside her, his breath coming in gasps, his body rigid with terror. She grabbed his shoulder and shook him. Callan, wake up. You're dreaming. His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused, and for a moment he didn't recognize her. Then reality crashed back and he curled into himself, arms wrapped around his ribs, breathing like he'd been running. I'm sorry. I should have warned you the nightmares were getting worse. She turned on the bedside lamp and saw the sweat soaking through his t-shirt, the tremor in his hands. What do you dream about? Watching her die. Over and over. Except sometimes it's Hadley dying and I can't stop it. Sometimes it's both of them. Sometimes... He stopped, his throat working. Sometimes what? Sometimes it's you and Bryn. And I'm trying to save you, but I can't move. And I wake up before I can stop it from happening. Something in Evangeline's chest cracked wide open. Look at me. Breathe with me. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. She'd learned this technique from the crisis counselor the court had mandated after Preston filed for divorce, and she walked Callan through it until his breathing stabilized. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were clearer. How did you know to do that? Panic attacks. I've had them since the FBI raid. Sometimes I wake up thinking I'm still in my car with Bryn and we have nowhere to go, and I can't breathe because the walls are closing in. They looked at each other in the dim lamplight, two people who'd been performing stability while drowning in private terrors, and something fundamental shifted. I don't think we can keep pretending this is just about fooling investigators. Evangeline's heart hammered. What do you mean? I mean, we're living together, sleeping in the same bed, raising kids together, and somewhere along the way it stopped being an act for me. I don't know when it happened. Maybe when you learned to make pot roast, maybe when Bryn started calling you by your first name instead of Miss Eva like you were a teacher. Maybe tonight when you sat on a garage floor at 3 a.m. and let me grieve without making me feel weak. But it stopped being fake. She wanted to argue, to maintain the boundaries that kept this safe, but she couldn't. For me, it stopped being fake when you came home in the middle of your workday, just so the investigator would have photos of us having lunch together. When you memorized Bryn's allergy like your own daughter's life depended on it. When you asked me about my job search like it mattered whether I ever worked again. Callan reached out and took her hand, and the touch felt like admitting something they'd both been avoiding. After the hearing, after we win, I'm going to ask you to stay. Not for the court, for me. What if we don't win? Then I'm asking you anyway, because somewhere between the desperation and the performance and the nightmares at 2 a.m., I fell in love with you. And I'm terrified because I swore I'd never do this again, but I'm more terrified of you leaving. Evangeline looked at their joined hands, at this man who'd become her lifeline and her partner, and possibly the person who'd saved her in ways that had nothing to do with providing an address. I don't know if I'm ready to call it love, but I know when I think about the hearing being over, about going back to being alone with Bryn in an apartment somewhere, I can't breathe, and I don't know if that's love or trauma bonding or just desperate gratitude, but it feels real enough to scare me. He pulled her closer, and she let him, and they lay there in the lamplight while the truth they'd been avoiding finally took up residence between them. This wasn't pretend anymore. It wasn't a performance. It was real and messy and complicated and possibly the most honest thing either of them had built in years. And they had 68 days to figure out if it could survive the weight of the truth. The confession hung between them like a promise neither had planned to make, and in the days that followed, everything shifted. Not dramatically. There were no grand romantic gestures or declarations shouted from rooftops. But in the small moments, in the accumulated weight of daily intimacy, something fundamental had changed. Callan started leaving notes on the coffee maker. Simple things. Taking Hadley to dentist at 3, home by 5, want me to grab dinner? Evangeline responded with her own additions to the grocery list, small observations about what made the household function. Bryn wants the strawberry yogurt, not vanilla. Hadley's favorite show is on tonight at 7. They were building the architecture of a real relationship from the blueprint of a fake one, and neither of them mentioned how seamlessly the transition was happening. 54 days until the final hearing. Angela Reeves's second visit came on a Tuesday at 10 p.m., exactly the kind of unannounced intrusion designed to catch people off guard. Evangeline answered the door in pajama pants and one of Callan's old construction company t-shirts, her hair in a messy bun, laptop open on the coffee table where she'd been working on a consulting proposal. Angela walked through the house with her clipboard and assessing gaze, noting the dishes in the sink from dinner, the backpacks by the door ready for morning, the living room where Callan sat on the floor helping Hadley build a Lego castle, while Bryn arranged furniture in a dollhouse. The television played a nature documentary that no one was watching. It was the tableau of ordinary family chaos, and Angela spent 45 minutes trying to find the seams. She found none. When she left, her expression was marginally less neutral than before, and Evangeline allowed herself to believe they'd crossed another checkpoint. But the relief lasted less than 12 hours. The next morning, a courier delivered a thick manila envelope to the house. Inside were 47 pages of legal documents, and Evangeline's hands shook as she read the cover letter from Marcus Henderson. Motion to compel financial disclosure and testimony under oath. Petitioner submits evidence of financial instability presenting ongoing risk to minor child's welfare. The documents detailed Callan's business finances with surgical precision. Reed & Sons Construction owed $47,000 across 3 suppliers: Portland Concrete and Supply, Columbia Rebar, and Westside Lumber. Payment schedules showed he'd been slowly catching up, but $18,000 remained outstanding. Marcus had highlighted every late payment, every collection notice, every evidence that Callan was a man drowning in debt who couldn't provide the stability a child required. There were bank statements showing Callan's personal account hovering between $300 and $800 most months. There were tax returns revealing he'd barely broken even the previous year. There was a lien filed against the house for unpaid property taxes that had only been satisfied 6 months ago. The final paragraph twisted the knife. Mr. Reed's precarious financial situation, combined with Ms. Colton's complete unemployability and documented bankruptcy, demonstrates that this household cannot provide adequate material support for a minor child. Petitioner requests court order compelling both parties to testify under oath regarding their financial arrangement and the true nature of their relationship. Petitioner further requests immediate transfer of temporary custody pending resolution of fraud allegations. Evangeline read it twice, then set the papers down on the kitchen table and pressed her palms flat against the wood to stop her hands from shaking. This was it. This was how Preston would win. Not by proving she was a bad mother, but by proving she'd aligned herself with a man who was as financially broken as she was. She heard Callan's truck in the driveway and had a moment of wild panic. Should she hide the documents? Pretend she hadn't seen them? Give him a few more hours of peace before his private failures became public ammunition? He walked in through the garage door, still in his work clothes, and knew immediately something was wrong. What happened? She pushed the envelope across the table toward him. Preston's lawyers did a deep dive into your finances. They're going to destroy you on the stand. They're going to make you look like a con artist who preys on desperate women, and they're going to use your debt to prove neither of us can provide stability for Bryn. Callan picked up the papers and read in silence, his jaw tightening with each page. When he finished, he set them down very carefully, as if they might explode. I should have told you about the debt, about how bad things got after Juliet died. But I didn't want you to think. He stopped, running both hands through his hair in the gesture she'd learned meant he was trying to hold himself together. Think what? That I was using you the same way you thought you were using me. That I needed someone to help with bills and childcare, and that's why I offered to help. That it was transactional instead of... His voice cracked, and Evangeline stood up and crossed to where he stood against the counter. Instead of what? Instead of the first time in 2 years I felt like I had a reason to come home other than obligation. She took the papers from his hands and threw them on the floor with a violence that surprised them both. Then we fight. We show the judge your payment history. We prove you've been paying down the debt every month even when it meant you ate pizza for dinner 5 nights a week because you couldn't afford better. We show them that financial struggle isn't the same as financial irresponsibility. Callan looked at her with something close to desperation. And what about the part where they ask under oath if we're really in a relationship? What do we say? That we met in a diner 3 months ago because you were about to lose your daughter and I decided to play white knight? That we've been performing intimacy for a judge while falling into something real that neither of us knows how to define? She stepped closer, close enough to see the exhaustion written in every line of his face. We say we're two people who found each other in the worst moment of our lives and decided not to drown alone. We say we're building something real from something that started as survival. We say the truth, that sometimes family isn't born from perfect circumstances. It's built from broken pieces that fit together better than anything whole ever did. He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. When did you get so good at making disasters sound like destiny? When I started believing that maybe this one actually is. They spent that night at the kitchen table with calculators and bank statements, building a defense from the wreckage of their financial lives. Callan pulled out every receipt, every payment confirmation, every piece of documentation proving he'd been honoring his debts even when it hurt. Evangeline organized them into a timeline that showed a man slowly climbing out of a hole, not a man who'd given up. By 3 a.m., they had a narrative. Not a perfect one, but a true one. And if the truth wasn't enough, then nothing they invented would be either. 48 days until the hearing. The week that followed brought Angela Reeves back for her third and final evaluation, this time at 6:30 in the morning while everyone was still in pajamas and the kitchen was a hurricane of cereal bowls and spilled orange juice and two children arguing about whose turn it was to feed the goldfish they'd bought at PetSmart the previous weekend. Angela stood in the doorway observing the chaos with the clinical eye of someone who'd seen every variation of family dysfunction and could spot the authentic from the performed. She watched Callan braid Hadley's hair with the focused intensity of someone who'd practiced in YouTube videos until his fingers learned the pattern. She watched Evangeline pack lunches with the efficient precision of someone who'd memorized food preferences and allergy protocols. She watched Bryn help Hadley find her missing library book and Hadley share her favorite purple crayon without being asked. After 20 minutes, Angela pulled Evangeline aside in the living room while Callan was getting the girls into their jackets. "Miss Colton, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I can usually tell within the first visit whether a household is genuine or constructed for my benefit. When I came here the first time, I wasn't sure about you two. The details were too perfect. The story too neat." Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs. "And now? Now I see a family that's messy and imperfect and real. I see two adults who are still figuring out how to navigate each other but who both put the children's needs first. I see kids who feel safe enough to argue about goldfish and trust that the adults won't fall apart." She pulled a sealed envelope from her portfolio. "This is my final recommendation to Judge Morrison. Don't open it until the hearing. But I'll tell you what I told the judge when she called this morning for a preliminary assessment. You're not perfect. Your finances are a mess and your relationship timeline raises questions. But those kids are thriving. And at the end of the day, that's what matters." She left, and Evangeline stood holding the envelope like it contained either salvation or destruction, unable to determine which until January 15th. That night, Callan came home with flowers from the grocery store, cheap carnations in a plastic wrapper, but flowers nonetheless. He set them on the kitchen counter where Evangeline was chopping vegetables for dinner. "What are these for?" "Because in all the chaos of pretending to be a couple, I never actually took you on a date. And I realized I want to. Not for Angela or the judge or Preston's investigators. Just because." Evangeline looked at the flowers, at this man who'd given her a home and stability and something that felt dangerously close to happiness, and felt her carefully constructed defenses crack wide open. "When?" "Saturday night. I already asked Mrs. Whitmore next door to watch the girls. She's been wanting to spend time with them anyway." Mrs. Louise Whitmore was the 72-year-old retired teacher who lived 3 houses down and had been Callan's neighbor for 15 years. She'd appeared on the porch 2 weeks after Evangeline moved in with a casserole and a knowing look that suggested she'd seen right through their arrangement and approved anyway. Saturday arrived with the quality of something both inevitable and terrifying. Evangeline spent an hour trying to figure out what to wear for a first date with a man she'd been sleeping next to for 2 months, whose child called her Miss Eva, whose nightmares she'd learned to navigate. She finally settled on jeans and a blue sweater that Sloane had sent in a care package, and when she came downstairs, Callan was waiting in the living room wearing dark jeans and a button-down shirt that looked like he'd ironed it himself. They drove to a restaurant in downtown Beaverton, a small Italian place with red checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles. Nothing fancy, but chosen with care. Over pasta and cheap red wine, they talked about things that had nothing to do with custody battles or CPS evaluations or the performance they'd been staging. They talked about the lives they'd had before everything fell apart. Evangeline told him about the early days of BrightPath, when it was just her and 2 developers working out of a shared office space in the Pearl District, surviving on ramen and venture capital pitch meetings. About the first time they'd landed a major contract and she'd cried in the bathroom because she couldn't believe someone had trusted her vision. About the moment she'd realized Trevor Walsh was stealing from her and the company she'd built was about to become another cautionary tale about trusting the wrong people. Callan told her about inheriting his father's construction business at 26 when a heart attack killed the old man mid-pour on a foundation job. About learning on the fly how to manage crews and bids and the dozens of ways a project could go sideways. About meeting Juliet at a friend's wedding and knowing within 20 minutes that he'd marry her if she'd have him. About the 2 years between her diagnosis and her death, watching someone he loved disappear by degrees while he pretended to be strong enough for both of them. I used to think I'd done something wrong, that if I'd noticed sooner or pushed harder for different treatments or been a better husband, maybe she'd still be here. My therapist says that's called magical thinking, but it doesn't feel magical. It just feels like failure. Evangeline reached across the table and took his hand. I used to think if I'd been a better CEO, I would have caught the embezzlement sooner. If I'd paid more attention to the numbers instead of the vision, if I'd been less trusting and more suspicious, maybe I could have stopped it. But trauma doesn't care about what we could have done differently. It just keeps telling us we failed even when the failure was someone else's. They looked at each other across the checkered tablecloth. 2 people who'd spent months performing intimacy while hiding their real selves, finally allowing the performance to become something true. I'm going to kiss you now, not for any audience, not for any reason except that I want to. He leaned across the table, and she met him halfway, and the kiss tasted like red wine and second chances, and the terrifying possibility that they might actually survive this. 31 days until the hearing. The motion to depose arrived on a Monday morning, scheduling both Callan and Evangeline for testimony under oath on January 8th, exactly 1 week before the final custody hearing. It included a list of questions they'd be required to answer, and reading through them felt like watching someone methodically dismantle your life with surgical instruments. Describe in detail the circumstances under which you met Ms. Colton. What financial discussions have you had regarding shared expenses? At what point did your relationship become romantic versus cohabitational? Have you ever been intimate in a way that would be inappropriate to discuss in front of minor children? That last question made Evangeline throw the papers across the room. They're trying to humiliate us. They're going to ask about our sex life in front of a court reporter and then use whatever we say to prove we're either lying or inappropriate. Callan picked up the papers and read through them with the methodical calm that Evangeline had learned meant he was processing something too big to show on his face. They're fishing. If we say we're intimate, they claim we rushed into a sexual relationship in front of the kids. If we say we're not, they claim it's proof the relationship is fake. So what do we say? We say the truth, that we're two adults building a relationship at a pace that feels right for us and our children, that what happens in our bedroom is private and appropriate and none of Marcus Henderson's business. But the questions kept coming, each one designed to expose contradictions or force confessions. By the time they reached the end of the list, Evangeline felt like she'd been filleted. They spent the next week preparing like lawyers training for a trial, running through questions and answers until they could recite them in their sleep. But every practice session revealed new gaps in their story, places where the truth and the performance didn't quite align. When did you first tell Ms. Colton you loved her? Callan paused, and Evangeline saw the conflict play out on his face. I told her I was falling in love with her after she sat with me in the garage at 3 a.m. while I went through my dead wife's things. But I don't know if that's the answer that helps us or hurts us. She reached for his hand. Then we tell the truth and let the judge decide if it's good enough. The deposition took place in a conference room at Marcus Henderson's law firm, a glass tower in downtown Portland that screamed money and power. Evangeline sat across from Marcus and 2 associates, with a court reporter recording every word, and tried not to feel like she was on trial for the crime of wanting to keep her daughter. Marcus started with the easy questions, establishing timeline and basic facts. Then he moved in for the kill. Ms. Colton, you claim you met Mr. Reed 7 months ago in March. Can anyone corroborate this story? The waitress at Riverside Diner. Her name is Della. She's worked there 20 years and she remembers us. How convenient that you found a witness to a meeting that I suspect never happened. Let me ask you directly, Ms. Colton. Did you in fact meet Mr. Reed for the first time on October 10th, the night before your initial custody hearing? The room held its breath. This was the moment. The question they'd known was coming, but hadn't figured out how to answer without either committing perjury or admitting fraud. Evangeline looked Marcus Henderson in his cold, shark eyes and made a choice. I met Callan Reed at Riverside Diner on the night of October 10th. We spoke for approximately 30 minutes. He offered me housing, and I accepted. But the relationship we've built over the past 3 months is real. The family we've created is real. And if you want to call that fraud because it didn't start the way traditional relationships start, then you're admitting that love and family can only exist in one prescribed format, which says more about your narrow definition of family than it does about the legitimacy of ours. Marcus smiled like she'd just handed him exactly what he needed. So, you admit that your entire relationship with Mr. Reed is predicated on a lie told to a family court judge. You admit that you manufactured a family structure to avoid losing custody. You admit that everything you've presented to this court is a performance. I admit that I was desperate. I admit that I accepted help from a stranger because the alternative was losing my daughter to a man who wants her as a trophy, not as a child he loves. But what happened after that night wasn't performance. What happened after that night was 2 broken people deciding that building something together was better than drowning separately. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, and Evangeline knew she'd just given him the ammunition to destroy her. Callan's deposition the following day was no gentler. Marcus went after the debt with the precision of someone dismantling a Jenga tower, pulling out each piece of evidence that Callan was financially unstable, that he'd taken in a desperate woman because he needed help with childcare and bills, that the whole arrangement was transactional rather than romantic. Mr. Reed, you owe $18,000 in outstanding business debt. Your personal savings account averages less than $500. Your mortgage is underwater. How exactly do you plan to provide for 2 additional people when you can barely support yourself? Callan didn't flinch. I provide by working 60-hour weeks. I provide by paying down my debts every month, even when it means I eat pizza for dinner because it's cheaper than cooking. I provide by showing up for the people who depend on me even when I'm exhausted and scared and don't know if I'm doing anything right. You want to know what stability looks like? It's not a bank balance. It's showing up. It's doing the hard work of being present even when you have nothing left to give. That's what I provide, Mr. Henderson, and if that's not good enough for you, it's good enough for those girls. Marcus made notes on his legal pad, and Evangeline watched from the corner of the conference room, her heart in her throat. They left the depositions knowing they'd given Marcus everything he needed to argue fraud. The only question was whether Judge Morrison would care more about the technicalities of how they met or the reality of what they'd built. 10 days until the hearing. Preston himself appeared at the house on a Wednesday afternoon, his Mercedes S-Class looking absurdly out of place on their middle-class street. Evangeline answered the door and found her ex-husband standing on the porch with an expression she'd never seen before, something that might have been doubt masquerading as arrogance. "I came to see Bryn. It's my custody day." "Your custody day is tomorrow. Wednesday is mine." Preston pulled out his phone and showed her the custody schedule. "Wednesday, 3 p.m. to Friday, 3 p.m. Check the order." She checked. He was right. In the chaos of depositions and preparations, she'd lost track of the rotation. "She's not home yet. Bus comes at 3:30. Preston leaned against the porch railing, and Evangeline resisted the urge to tell him Callan had just replaced that wood last week. "Can we talk before she gets home?" Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, but she stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind her. "What do you want, Preston?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she realized with shock that he looked tired. Not just physically tired, but the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying weight you weren't built to bear. "My grandfather died last week. Heart failure. Very peaceful, apparently, though I doubt anything about Lawrence Colton was ever truly peaceful." Evangeline felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Lawrence had been the architect of this entire custody battle, the puppet master pulling Preston's strings. "I'm sorry. I know you and he weren't close, but he was still family. He left everything to a trust that I'll inherit when I turn 40, with one condition. I have to prove I'm a fit parent with primary custody of a minor child. No custody, no trust, no trust, no estate, and I'm just another Colton who failed to live up to the family name." He laughed, but it sounded hollow. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm just explaining why this is happening the way it's happening. I don't actually want Bryn. I never wanted custody. I wanted to prove to a 90-year-old man that I was responsible enough to deserve his money. And now he's dead, and the trust is locked, and I'm about to go into court and destroy the only functional family Bryn's ever known because I'm too much of a coward to tell the executor I don't deserve the inheritance." Evangeline stared at him, anger and pity and exhaustion warring in her chest. "Then don't do it. Withdraw the custody petition. Tell the executor that Bryn is better off with me. Let this be the one thing you do that isn't about appearances or money or the Colton name." Preston looked at her with something that might have been regret. "I can't. I've already spent 6 months telling everyone that you're unfit, that Bryn needs to be rescued from her disaster of a mother. If I back down now, I look weak. And weak Coltons don't last in this family." He straightened up and checked his watch. "I'll pick Bryn up at 3:30. Have her ready." He left before she could respond, and Evangeline stood on the porch watching his Mercedes disappear down Elmwood Drive, understanding for the first time that Preston was as trapped by his family's expectations as she'd ever been by poverty. That night, after Bryn left for her 2 days with Preston, Evangeline and Callan sat on the couch with a bottle of wine between them and tried to process what was coming. In 4 days, they'd stand in front of Judge Morrison and have their relationship dissected by lawyers who specialized in finding the rot in foundations. "What if we lose?" Callan pulled her closer, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Then we appeal. Then we fight harder. Then we figure out what comes next. But we don't lose each other. That's not part of the deal anymore. She tilted her head back to look at him. When did it stop being a deal and start being something else? For me? The night you told me about your panic attacks and didn't make me feel broken for having nightmares. The moment I realized you weren't here because you needed me, but because we needed each other. She kissed him then, slow and deep, and for the first time since October, they let the kiss become more than just a promise. They'd been sleeping next to each other for months, building trust in the dark, and now the performance finally caught up to the reality. When the three went upstairs, there were no pillow walls. There was just two people who'd found each other in the worst moment of their lives and decided that surviving together was better than surviving alone. January 15th arrived like a guillotine. The courtroom was packed. Preston with his legal team, Lawrence's estate executor, a handful of Colton family members who looked like they'd wandered in from a country club brunch. Evangeline sat next to Callan wearing the same theory blazer from the first hearing, her hand gripping his so tightly she was probably cutting off circulation. Judge Morrison entered, and the room fell silent. Final custody hearing, Bryn Colton. I've reviewed the depositions, the CPS reports, and the financial disclosures. Mr. Henderson, present your closing argument. Marcus Henderson stood with the confidence of someone who'd already won. Your Honor, the evidence is overwhelming. Ms. Colton has admitted under oath that her relationship with Mr. Reed began as a fraud perpetrated to circumvent this court's ruling. She has admitted that she manufactured a family structure for the sole purpose of retaining custody. Mr. Reed has significant debt and limited financial resources. Together, they represent an unstable household built on deception. My client offers a 7-bedroom estate, unlimited financial resources, and a family legacy that will provide opportunities Ms. Colton cannot match. The choice should be clear. He sat down, and Judge Morrison turned to Evangeline. Ms. Colton, you admitted in your deposition that you met Mr. Reed the night before our first hearing. You admitted that your relationship began as what you called survival rather than romance. What do you have to say to convince me that what you've built is real and not simply an elaborate performance designed to deceive this court? Evangeline stood up, her legs shaking, and made a decision. She'd spent 3 months performing stability. Now, she was going to tell the truth. Your Honor, I can't tell you that how we started was honest, because it wasn't. I can't tell you that I met Callan Reed under romantic circumstances, and we fell in love over candlelit dinners, because we didn't. I met him in a diner when I was living in my car and about to lose my daughter, and he offered me a lifeline because he's the kind of man who can't watch someone drown without trying to help. That's the truth. That's the fraud Mr. Henderson keeps talking about. But what happened after that first night wasn't fraud. What happened was 2 broken people and 2 children who needed stability deciding to build something real from the pieces we had left. You want to know if it's a real family? Ask Bryn if she feels safe. Ask Hadley if she's lonely anymore. Ask Callan if he's still going through the motions or if he has a reason to come home. Ask me if I'm still the desperate woman sleeping in her car or if I've found a place where I can breathe. The answer to all of those questions is yes. This is real. This is family. And if you take Bryn away from us because we didn't build it the traditional way, you're saying that only one kind of family counts, the perfect kind. The kind that starts with romance and proposals and registry at Crate and Barrel. But that's not the only way families are made. Sometimes they're built from desperation and survival, and 2 people deciding that together is better than alone. And if that's not good enough for this court, then I don't know what else I can say except that my daughter is loved and safe and happy, and that should matter more than how her family was assembled. She sat down, her hands shaking, and Callan squeezed her fingers. Judge Morrison was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to Preston. Mr. Colton, do you wish to address the court? Preston stood slowly, and Evangeline held her breath. Your Honor, I'd like to withdraw my petition for full custody. The courtroom erupted. Marcus Henderson was on his feet immediately, objecting, arguing, but Preston held up a hand. I've spent 6 months fighting for custody of a daughter I barely know, because my grandfather demanded it as a condition of inheritance. He died last week, and I had a choice. I could keep fighting to prove I deserved his money, or I could admit that Bryn deserves better than being a pawn in a family power play. My ex-wife is building something real with Mr. Reed. Their household isn't perfect, but it's functional and loving and stable in ways that matter more than bank balances. I'd like joint custody with regular visitation, but primary custody should remain with the mother. Judge Morrison looked at Preston with something that might have been respect. Mr. Colton, are you certain about this decision? Yes, Your Honor. For the first time in 6 months, I'm certain about something. The judge made notes on her papers, then looked at Callan and Evangeline. Ms. Colton, primary custody remains with you. Mr. Colton will have visitation every other weekend and alternating holidays. Mr. Reed, this court recognizes you as a significant parental figure in Bryn's life and grants you emergency contact status. CPS will conduct one final follow-up visit in 6 months to ensure continued stability. This case is closed. The gavel came down, and Evangeline collapsed against Callan, sobbing with relief so intense it felt like drowning. They'd won, against every odd, against every mistake, against the weight of their own broken histories. They'd won. In the hallway, Preston approached them one final time. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I'd like to be part of Bryn's life. Not as the father who tried to take her away, but as someone who shows up when he says he will. If you'll let me. Evangeline looked at the man she'd once loved, who'd abandoned her in the worst moment of her life, and found something unexpected. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. They were all just people trying to survive their family's expectations and their own failures. Every other weekend, and you don't miss a single one. Bryn deserves a father who shows up. 6 months later, the house on Elmwood Drive looked different in ways that had nothing to do with paint or furniture. The roses that Callan had planted in the spring were blooming in wild profusion along the fence. The porch swing that he'd finally hung in March creaked gently in the summer breeze. Inside, the refrigerator was covered with report cards and art projects and a calendar marking visitation schedules and family dinners and the ordinary chaos of life. Angela Reeves arrived for her final follow-up on a Saturday afternoon, finding the house full of noise and life and the particular brand of disorder that came from children who felt safe enough to make messes. She stayed for exactly 45 minutes, made her notes, and delivered her final assessment on the porch. This is what stability looks like. Not perfection, but permanence. Keep doing what you're doing. That evening, after the girls were asleep and the dishes were done and the summer darkness settled soft over the neighborhood, Callan found Evangeline on the porch swing, staring at the street where her Mercedes had once idled while she lived out of the back seat. He sat down beside her and pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. We already told everyone we're married. We already share a bed and a mortgage and 2 kids who call this place home. But I realized I never actually asked you, not with words that weren't about survival or custody or fooling investigators. So I'm asking now, Evangeline Colton, will you marry me? Not because we have to, not because it helps with court or appearances or anything, except that I love you. And I want to spend the rest of my life building this messy, imperfect, real family with you. She looked at the ring. Simple silver with a small diamond that probably cost him a month of debt payments. And then at the man who'd saved her by letting her save him. Yes, not because I need you, because I choose you every day, for the rest of however long we get. He slid the ring onto her finger, and they sat on the porch swing watching the street where their story had started in desperation and ended in something that felt remarkably like home. Sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. Sometimes the best miracles are the ones that walk up to you in a diner and offer their hand when the whole world has turned its back. They'd started as strangers performing survival. They'd become the truest thing either of them had ever built. And that was worth more than any trust fund, any mansion, any traditional definition of how families were supposed to be made. It was simply worth everything.